Hi, everyone. Thanks, Seed, for the introduction. You've already sort of laid a lot of the groundwork that I don't need to go into now, so that shaves off a good portion for me. Um, I am a researcher. My background is in mostly violence and mental health, and I've been fortunate enough to work with ESWA in the past. I worked with Procure, which is a Swiss national organization for sex workers. I'm also currently working with National Ugly Mugs. Um, a bit about sort of like my early involvement in this project and the whys around that. I was part of ESWA. I had just finished working for an organization where I had become incredibly frustrated and disillusioned because research that I was part of coordinating had then sort of become had been left to the wayside and had sort of been just tabled because the organization felt that many of the findings, and specifically recommendations surrounding sex work decriminalization, surrounding access to PrEP and HRT, were too political to, move forward and were causing sort of different ruptures in the organization. And so this was, at a time that I was between work. I was sex working to make ends meet, and I just sort of decided to start an initial draft, so it were. And it's incredible to have, seen the work that Laura and also V, who's currently a colleague of mine as well, have done in putting the final product together, of course, with all of the input from organizations throughout ESWA's network. But I think, as we know, that was summer of 2023, and a lot has changed since then on the, international political and also sort of moral stage. We've seen to a large degree the sort of complete shattering of that illusion of universities as being bastions of free speech and human rights, specifically reflected in the crackdown to student movements for Palestine and any sort of calls for academic boycotts of the ongoing Israeli genocide in Gaza. And I was incredibly happy to see that within the guidance, as I'm sure Laura will go through, there's that recognition that this is sort of like a living standards, and these will be, adapting and going forward based on developments that are, of concern to sex worker movements and those that we ally ourselves with. And I think sort of a question for me that came up in then reading them was looking at, what is the role of sex workers and our movements in engaging with academia in trying to kind of prop up and support these student movements or calls for BDS or wider calls for, divestment in colonial ties and things like that. Um, we've also sort of seen that I'm just looking at a couple of my notes here. We've also witnessed in recent times a very pernicious push towards anti-science, which has coalesced with the rise of anti-gender movements. Of course, throughout many countries and in impacting to a large degree European countries and European sex worker rights movement, and we feel the effects on our own movements and organizations. We've seen recently the announcement of closing of National Ugly Mugs Ireland, the endangerment of Sway, and so forth. And I think anyone who works in that kind of donor-facing role can attest to the extreme difficulty in now procuring funding and securing longevity of this kind of work. We're also witnessing the rise of digital fascism, as we all know, in the UK and in Germany, I believe, France, although there's been some recent movement to that front. The Online Safety Act now moving towards crackdown and policing of sex workers in online space, but that having now extended towards the general population, and those sort of alarms that we had already raised for, the last number of years being felt by wider society. And we know that we have a great role in sort of countering those things because, of course, they are incredibly salient to our own existence and to our own safety and livelihoods. So I suppose it's a bit of a bit of an uncertain time. A lot of there's a lot of I think fear all around as to whether research will continue to be taken seriously. I think there's questions around what are the ways we can and have an obligation to engage and push back in the sort of like anti-science, anti-evidence base push that's going on in national and regional agendas. Um, um, so just to say a bit about a project that I am now working on with my colleague V, who's here and who's also worked on the standards. We're working on a project called Swerve. It stands for Sex Workers Evaluating Reporting Violence, and it is a project and an effort to evaluate the use of national ugly mugs here in the UK and to investigate whether the numb tools lead to reductions in prevalence of violence against sex workers and improvements in our mental health. I see it as in some way being a bit of a watershed because if it's possible to have evidence to attest to those outcomes, that is fantastic. Um, that's fantastic contributing to the evidence base for anti-carceral and community-driven safety mechanisms. Um, we're a National Health Institute research funded project, which is, of course, that speaks to that there are allies in those echelons and it's possible for us to find them. Of course, it's not perfect. There are still questions that we, need to grapple with and ask ourselves in any kind of funding that's being given and to the majority to academic institutions, the disparities between the funding that then gets funneled to the national or sort of the actual community organizations that are working on those projects. There's also, continual questions, and I was again very happy to see kind of reflected this need to resource and ensure that sex workers can actually enter academia and take up those roles, which we are seeing more and more. But of course, there are questions that we have to ask ourselves surrounding, the fact that so many of us who are doing research surrounding sex work actually have to sex work in order to be able to sustain ourselves on the wages that we are receiving and so forth, or in order to, get into academia in the first place and go through sort of like, degrees, qualifications, having credentials, and so forth. For a lot of us, those are sort of sex work is the means through which we can do that. So there's still many questions there surrounding resource allocation. And I think a final point that I'll just mention is that um, we in the Swerve project are trying, again, not perfectly, but trying to be conscious of the fact that as having ties to academic institutions and a certain amount of, clout that brings, we know that our opponents will do anything to discredit our voices. We've seen what played out in the Swedish parliament in response to the move to criminalize online forms of sex work, for example. So I think academic institutions and anyone working with them need to take into account that there is a responsibility there to be engaging in advocacy specifically to make sure that pushes to further criminalize our livelihoods are we're feeding evidence into that and we're pushing back against those things. So we've tried to feed evidence into calls for the online sorry, not the online, the crime and policing bill in the UK and most recently Ash Regan's bill in Scotland. I think that's all I'll say for now, and I know that Laura will take you through all of the standards and we'll have lots of time for discussion. So thanks everyone for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the opening speech. And I would like to also acknowledge that the contributions of Victoria Holt. Earlier, I didn't mention you. I'm so sorry. I apologize. It wasn't on purpose. So Laura, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for especially connecting the political dimensions of the research and how, the two can feed into one another and how it should be basically understood as together. I will now give the floor to Laura Connolly, who will introduce herself to us and also introduce the report.
Thank you. I'm going to share some slides. Just bear with me whilst I do that. Okay, cool. Can you see those okay? Yeah, I can see some nods. Okay, amazing. All right. Well, I'll also start with some thanks, if that's okay. So I wanted to thank Elizabeth both for the presentation now and that really helpful context setting, but also for all your hard work in getting us to this stage. Thanks to the ESWA team for all of your efforts, and lots of that stuff goes on behind the scenes, and I know it's a bit of a thankless task. So yeah, I'm saying thanks. And thanks to V, who's also got lots of shout outs already, but has done amazing work. Thank you for all that you've done and all of your support and kindness. And then thanks to all of you for coming along. I know people are busy, taking time out of your day is difficult, but thanks for coming and listening. And I hope you find some of this useful. So, as you mentioned, my name's Laura. I'm an academic. I'm based at the University of Sheffield in the UK. I sit on the board of trustees of National Ugly Mugs, which Elizabeth's already mentioned, and lots of you might know. It's an organisation based in the UK and works to end violence against sex workers. And in my free time, I organise with a group called the Northern Police Monitoring Project, and that's really my passion. It's a community-based group in Manchester, which is where I live. So yeah, that's a little background on me. And I thought I'd also just start with a little bit, just briefly, about how V and I came together with ESWA around this work. So I became involved in the project when ESWA reached out, knowing that I'd been working separately with V on a study where we were interviewing sex workers and asking them for their views and their experiences about being involved in research. So, whether that had been as participants, people who'd taken part in research, or whether it had been as peer researchers on research projects or leading research projects themselves. And I suppose what our core aim was we wanted to use those accounts of sex workers to shape a more ethical and responsible approach to sex work research, particularly within academia. So we saw this when ESWA reached out as an amazing opportunity to bring two really similar pieces of work together and join efforts. V and my project and the important work that Elizabeth had begun. And that's really where this report sort of emerged from my perspective. I want to say from the outset, I am not an expert on research ethics. I don't sit on a research committee, and I don't claim to be the perfect sex work researcher either. I suppose the contributions that I've brought to this report is grounded in the insights of sex workers. It's from those interviews with sex workers. And then I've worked to ensure that sex workers have continued to shape this report as it's progressed. And so, again, one more thanks. I'd like to echo Yeat's thanks to the sex worker organisations that generously gave up their time to provide comments on this draft, and also to ESWA as well. So yeah, today I'll spend no more than 20 minutes now just introducing you to the report, just to give you a bit of a flavour of what we've tried to do. Okay, so a little bit of context first of all. Academic research on the topic of sex work raises lots of ethical issues, and I think it's fair to say it is a deeply contentious topic. While, of course, not all research about sex work comes from academia, academic research remains probably the most common and is often the most harmful as well. As Elizabeth said before, academia has long since been criticised, including for its colonial and paternalistic structures, and for the ways in which academics have too often mistreated people from marginalised communities. So, sex workers have spoken about being misrepresented in research, exploited by researchers, or excluded from research projects altogether. And many have expressed distrust towards academic research and pointing out that researchers have too often built careers on the backs of sex workers with little direct benefit to sex workers themselves. And actually, that research can sometimes cause lots of harm, directly and indirectly. At the same time, sex worker organisations are frequently approached by researchers seeking access or support. And yet these organisations are often under-resourced, and supporting academic projects is rarely their priority, especially given that sometimes the benefits of the research to sex worker communities are not always that clear. I think one of the main criticisms of academic research from sex worker communities is that sex work research often fails to reflect sex workers' realities. It excludes sex workers from shaping the agenda, and then produces studies that can often reinforce harmful myths. We've seen this when sex workers are kind of portrayed in some public health research as like vectors of disease. Or, another example is around how sex workers are often portrayed in research primarily as like victims of trafficking. And these approaches have often sidelined sex worker voices and then contributed to policies that worsen stigma. They undermine health access. They ignore the issues that sex workers themselves want to prioritise, like things like economic security and safety, housing, poverty. The second key criticism I think we see often is that research can tend to overlook the diversity of sex workers and the diversity of sex work. And it relies sometimes on stereotypes that can erase the full range of sex workers' identities and experiences and ways of working. And of course, this leads to like a very simple, one-dimensional view of sex work. It reinforces stigma and again can feed into policies that don't meet the diverse needs of sex workers. So I suppose it's in this context then that sex workers have long called for their communities to be recognised as experts in research. And I mean that right from the start of a research project. So right from when the idea is being thought of, through to how a project is designed, and then right through to its completion when you're trying to influence policy or practice in some way, perhaps. So with this report, we add to those calls from sex workers and we provide some concrete guidance for what we hope would be will be safer and more ethical research that's more accountable to sex workers. The guidance document then is first and foremost a resource ESWA member organisation. So as lots of you might know, you might be a part of the ESWA kind of coalition. There are 100 members, 100 plus members across 30 countries in Europe and Central Asia. And we hope this will be a useful resource for some of those organisations or for other sex worker-led organisations that exist outside of that network. We want this to be a resource that helps organisations navigate their relationships with researchers. It sets out the high standards and expectations that sex worker organisations can and should insist on, we would say, when approached by or engaging with researchers. At the same time, the report is also intended as a resource for researchers themselves, especially those of us who might be wanting to reflect on our practice and improve how we work. It's particularly relevant, I think, for academics. As I said before, academic research on sex work probably does remain the most prolific form of research on sex work and the most harmful. And we hope the document lies in what we try to bring together. So this document is kind of built on the knowledge and the skills shared with us by sex workers. It's built on research, and it's also based on the insights that we get from existing literature, including some sex worker authored work. So together what we try to do then is bring these different strands together in one place and provide some accessible and practical guidelines for both sex worker organisations and researchers. All right. what are research ethics then? Just in case these sorts of terms are not familiar to some of you, perhaps they are, perhaps they're not. Briefly then, when we're talking about research ethics, I suppose what we mean is the kind of basic principles that should guide how research is done. So these principles are about making sure that our research does others and that the relationships built through research are respectful ones. More generally, ethics matter because they protect the rights and the well-being of participants. They help to build trust between research and inclusion, and they hold researchers accountable to professional standards, to legal standards, and to the community. Sex work research, then, we say in this report, requires particular ethical care. Sex workers, as many of you will know too well and don't need me to say, often face stigma, marginalisation, criminalisation, threat of deportation. So the risks of harmful research are arguably far greater than in lots of other fields where people do research, right? For example, being outed through research can have really serious consequences for sex workers. So we make a case in this document that sex work research requires heightened care. But when we say that, we don't mean to say that all sex workers should be seen as victims. In fact, ethical research avoids those really simplistic labels. And also we try sex work analysed. So good research needs to take into account the diversity of sex workers' identities, diversity of different lives and working practices, and the different positions from which sex workers engage in and with research. Before setting out some of the practical guidelines that we include in the report then, I just wanted to introduce you to what we sort of frame as 5 kind of overarching or key considerations for ethical sex work research. The first is accountability. So we argue in this document, in this report, that ethical research shouldn't be carried out by lone wolves, by which I mean isolated individuals that are completely disconnected from sex worker communities, but rather it should be carried out by researchers who are meaningfully embedded in sex worker communities or connected closely with sex worker-led organisations. And we say that this is beneficial because it means that there's direct accountability there. It allows sex workers to shape research in meaningful ways and to challenge researchers as well. And that helps to ensure that research is actually beneficial to sex workers. The second consideration is usefulness. So we argue that research should be guided by sex workers' needs and priorities, not by academic trends or by the whims of funders. And this means that sex workers then must have meaningful input into and actually control over research questions, priorities, timelines. The third is accessibility. So we argue that research shouldn't, as it often unfortunately is, shouldn't be locked solely behind academic journal paywalls where only a privileged few of us can access. Ethical research ensures that sex workers are actually able to access and use research findings rather than being excluded from work that's written about them. The fourth is lived experience. So we argue that sex workers should be central to both the design and also delivery of research projects. And of course, this strengthens research in too many ways than I could possibly go into today. But we do say it also requires a bit of care. We make the point in the document that lived experience is absolutely crucial in research, but that one voice doesn't stand for all. So what I mean by that is, a sex worker might have an authentic voice that's really important, but it's not necessarily a representative one. So as researchers, we need to think about making sure that some of the more marginalised sex worker voices feed into our research too, and avoid tokenism just including someone with lived experience in the research and then ticking off that box and moving on. So avoiding tokenism, I think, is crucial when we're thinking about embedding lived experience meaningfully in research projects. And then finally, and I think Elizabeth kind of touched on some of this in a really helpful thoughts at the start, I think we've also got to think about how oppressive academic spaces can be and start to decenter academia. Ethical research, I think, needs to challenge the idea that universities have this like monopoly on knowledge. So we should recognise and amplify the wealth of important research that's being produced outside of academia, including by sex worker-led organisations just like ESWA. All right, then the document ends with 7 pages of principles. These are kind of our practical guidelines around safe and ethical sex work research. I'm not going to go into each one today, don't worry, that there isn't time, but I'll flag a few examples to give you a bit of a sense of what we tried to do. So the first set of principles comes under the sort of banner of foundational ethics and safety, which covers the kind of core commitments that researchers should make to try to protect participants and ensure as best as we can that our work doesn't cause harm. One of these foundational principles is informed consent. Now, in most research, this isn't particularly groundbreaking. In most research, it's recognised that participants, by which I mean people who take part in the research, should be supported so that they can fully understand what the project is about, what will be done, how it will be carried out, and then any possible benefits or also any possible risks. And that's pretty standard. I think increasingly as well, some people have started to see that not as a one-off event. So don't just get a signature on your consent form and then forget about it, but see this process of informed consent as a process, as something that's ongoing, and check in with participants at various points to check they still consent. But we say that for sex work research, this ongoing consent is especially important because sex workers' circumstances can change quite a lot from the moment they take part in research to the moment that research is published. So, for example, someone might decide to leave sex work for a time and not want to be involved in the study any longer. They might move between sectors. They might get a new square job that sits alongside their sex work. And all of these circumstances might affect their desire to take part. So ongoing consent and being able to freely withdraw from a project is really crucial. Of course, we spoke to lots of sex workers who said they felt misrepresented in the research. So this opportunity to withdraw consent and withdraw oneself from a project is really important. We've also got a section on inclusive participation. One of the principles we've got there is around compensation. So I think it's fair to say that in traditional ethical guidelines and kind of lots of our committees that are in perhaps universities, for example, they can sometimes discourage us from paying our participants over concerns around inducement. So fear that we're kind of compelling people to take part in research because of the financial benefits of doing so. But we argue in this report that fair compensation is essential for recognising participants' expertise and actually making research more inclusive by reducing financial barriers to taking part. So in sex work research, this means paying fairly and, as far as possible, using the method of payment that participants themselves prefer. This can mean, in lots of circumstances, that we might have to push back against some of the academic norms in some of our universities, for example, where I know in my own and many others in the UK, the default has become gift vouchers, when in fact participants might often prefer cash. Next, we've got a section on power and collaboration. And one of the example principles here we include is that researchers should consider what we call participatory research methods. So methods where sex workers are involved, not just as participants in the research, but in the research itself. We argue then that researchers should consider these sorts of methods that actively involve sex workers, as it helps to make the research more useful. It helps to ensure that sex workers' knowledge and skills and expertise are embedded, and that research inevitably then is better able to address sex workers' needs and priorities. So produces more useful research. These approaches, I think, are especially useful in sex work research because, again, as I probably don't need to tell lots of you, sex workers are too often shut out of decisions that affect their lives, including around policies. So, considering these sorts of research methods where sex workers are meaningfully embedded in the research process and implementation is key. We do caution, though, in the report that this shouldn't be used as like a superficial tick box and that instead sex workers need to be involved meaningfully. In the principle that directly follows, we urge researchers to ensure that sex workers are embedded meaningfully in research projects, and that might mean that they have a key role in decision making and perhaps even control over how research is carried out. In the final section of the guidance, we've got principles that come under the banner of respectful communication and engagement. And here, for example, we urge researchers to be mindful of the language that they use, that language isn't neutral, it's never neutral. And to use the terms that are preferred by the communities that they're working with in the research. And this helps to show respect, it helps to ensure that research reflects the values and the identities of those that are involved in it. And again, this is especially important, we would argue, in sex work research, where, of course, stigmatizing terms are way too often commonplace. Of course, not all sex workers use the same terminology, so researchers need to recognise the different ways that sex workers describe themselves and their work. And I think in this respect, working with sex worker-led organisations can be really useful in helping to make sure that language is respectful of sex workers' diverse realities. All right, coming to an end here. While we've set out 7 pages of these kind of practical principles and guidance, the list isn't exhaustive and it's not universal, by which I mean to say it doesn't cover absolutely everything and it won't apply in every context everywhere. We hope that the document is a useful roadmap, a useful starting point, but we stress that sex workers are, of course, diverse, as I've mentioned time and time again today. And of course, then research needs and priorities and ways of working are, of course, going to differ. So we urge researchers to take these guidelines as a starting point, but adapt them where appropriate and in close conversation with the sex workers that are involved in their research. So that's my whistle-stop tour. I'm going to stop talking now. The report is freely available on ESWA's website. Do download a copy. Please share it with organisations that you're a part of or connected with researchers, with sex workers who might be being approached by researchers, and this can be a useful resource for them to say, yeah, we'd like you to read this report before we take part in research. I hope that this document's useful to you. If it is, or if you have any reflections, any thoughts that you'd like to share, I've put my email there. Please do reach out. I'd love to hear from you. All right. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the presentation. Yes, I hope you enjoyed the presentation from Laura. We will put the link to the resource in the chat. Shout out to our communications and campaign officer, Jebor. And you can hopefully download and read. But for now, we are open for questions, comments. It could be about your own work or about what you've just listened to. Anyone? Don't be shy.
I'll go. Thank you so much for what you shared. I think it's really so important, this document, and all of the work that everybody's been doing in this on this project. Um, I just wanted to comment that like all of what you're saying, I was just like doing a yes, yeah. It was just so spot on, and I think it's really important that we share this also with institutions. I recently just graduated from the University of Alberta, where a lot of the final work that I did was about sexual health and sex work. And one of the we had to do like weekly posts and stuff. And one of the weekly posts was about the ethics of research. And I brought up the topic of sex work, and it was really controversial. And a lot of students had a lot of things to say about it. But even the professors weren't even really sure how to direct the conversation. So it's really great that we have kind of a reference now that I could just be like, well, actually, this is a document that's been worked on by a whole bunch of people. That's these gold standards. I think it's absolutely incredible, and I really wish it would have came out last year when I was trying to debate with my professors. But I think that it's amazing, and thank you so much for all of your work. I also really like the part where you're talking about the inset specifically about the incentives was something that I got into a really big discussion with my classmates because a lot of people were debating about the incentives of like, cash versus gift cards and like, a lot of sex workers at the end of the day we have to pay our bills and like you can't pay your bills in in gift cards, but also some students were bringing up like the fact that they didn't want to, in terms of like they thought it was unethical to give sex workers money for their for the research project because then they could spend it on, and then they said like a whole bunch of very what do you call it? Stereotypical things like cliches about sex work. And so I think it's really important that this work is done and we have like a framework that we can present to people being like, hey, these are actually the real recommendations. So thanks so much for that.
Can I just add a little bit to that? Is that okay? Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
of
you
course.
so much for your kind words. I'm really pleased that some of it kind of resonated with what you've kind of experienced. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of come back on this point about institutions. I think that's a really, really important point that we need to try and reach out in our institutions and change some of the norms around how we do sex work research. The point about payment, I think, is a really tricky one as I kind of alluded to in the presentation. I have this conversation with within my institution all the time where the norm is gift vouchers, and they come up with so many different excuses for why gift vouchers are the only way we can possibly pay people. The like latest version is about something to do with tax, HMRC. But there are other places that are finding ways to pay people in cash or their preferred ways of doing it. So I think we do have to keep pushing wherever we can to try and change some of these norms because yeah, they don't align with what sex workers say they want. So yeah, it's our job, I think, as researchers to push in our institutions and try and get some of these kind of really inflexible and unhelpful yeah, norms shifted. So yeah, thank you for that.
Teresa, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. It's morning here in Canada, and it's even earlier for Callie because she's in Alberta. I'm in Toronto. I'm in Ontario. I wanted to thank you first of all for this, and like Callie said, I wish I'd had this document when I was doing my PhD, which I started in 2016. I would like to give this document, if that's okay, to my research ethics board. I work at a college now in Ontario. I was the first one, and after I graduated, I went to work at this college, and I was the first one ever in this college to do a project with sex workers. Just briefly, I'm creating a musical with sex workers. It's co-created with sex workers with the aim of dispelling stigma, because after the performance, we're going to have focus groups with civilians. So that's just to see if we could have moved the needle by having on stage the sex worker experiences. So having said that, so I would like to, if so I saw you nodding your head, I would like to pass this document on to my research ethics board. they didn't always understand what was going on, what I was trying to do. And to the point of the payments, when I suggested $50 an hour, the Research Ethics Board thought that was a coercive amount. Uh, and all the sex workers I have over half of the project team. My research project team is either current or former sex workers. So they're all like, no, no, that's actually, fine. It's a good amount because in Canada, sex workers start at $200 an hour. So I'm like, I'm like giving them a quarter of that. Also, I wanted to say it's interesting the difference between England, other European countries, and Canada. I was at University of Toronto for my PhD, and now I'm at George Brown College. They did not have any objections to paying people in cash. So I always find it very interesting that there's this divergence of ethics in Canada and in Europe. I'm not sure what it's like in the US. I'm not sure if there are any Americans here today, but I always find that very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Victoria.
Hi. Amazing, really interesting. And I'm not saying that because I help with it. I do actually think it's really interesting. My question is, and this is to like any member of the team, is how can this not all damaging or good or bad or whatever research is like, I guess, qualitative. And I'm just wondering how this report can be used either for the researchers that are going to come out and say, well, this isn't for the agentic sex worker community. This is for the victims, which I would argue aren't sex workers. They're like coerced victims, but like, kind of the more police or intervention style research. So how can this report be used? How might they find it useful? But also, what about the researchers that use more quantitative data scraping type methodologies, like the ones that will go on adult work and just pull the data and be like, well, they're foreign and or English isn't good. And, so they don't actually have like sex workers as part of their active participants. They're not interviewing, they're not surveying. So what role can this report, because I would argue that they're the kind of methodologies that might potentially be the most damaging, right? So yeah, I'm just wondering how might this report be useful for them?
I don't mind kicking things off, but yeah, feel free anyone else to chip in. I think that's a really good question. And I suppose we can't force people to engage with this, right? And the reality probably is that the people who are going to be willing to read this report in good faith and reflect on the harm that they might have caused and then make changes so they don't cause harm again are probably not the same people that you're talking about there. I think that like any kind of intervention we make when there's like an activist element to what we're doing, I think you can only speak to like the people in your, what do they call it, like spectrum of alliance, or I can't remember the term, but I think you can only persuade persuadable people. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that we should share it with those people and try to reach out to them. And I think it doesn't mean that this report isn't like a substitute for other ways in which we might call out or challenge bad work. It's a resource we can use when we call out bad work and say, look, this has been published. We encourage you to engage with it. But I think it still has to sit alongside like stuff that you've been involved in where you critique like dangerous work, right? Or when sex worker organizations release statements to that effect. I think we still do that stuff. This is just a supplementary resource that we can say, and look at this work we've done that will help you reflect on your bad practice. And we urge you to engage with it. But we can't ultimately force people to do that. I think that bad work needs to be called out and and replaced by good work. Like the more we do good work, the more that work is received well. Um, then yeah, I think that the more people are encouraged to like practice that same practice. Like I think we all know that bad work has won like impact awards, and often got funded, and we know that it's been harmful to sex workers. I think all we can do is try to replace that with good work, in my view.
Thank you so much, Laura. There is a question from Giovanna on the chat. Are there plans to translate the document into different languages? We do not have currently plans per se, but we always try to raise enough money to translate some of the resources that we produce. So it is definitely something we will be looking into. And then there is another question, again by Joanna. Have you gained the impression that the experiences of sex workers with researchers differ across different academic landscapes? If any one of you would like to also offer some comments on this, it's welcome. Otherwise, Elizabeth? Oh, sorry, Tom. I didn't see you there.
I'm happy for Elizabeth to go first.
All right, Elizabeth.
Yeah, V's question just also made me think about like the issue of the rise of AI and like use of AI in research, because that's something that has been like sort of gone unchecked and is mushrooming and occurring in ways that I think we are all not aware of as researchers and in the research community. So it's like not only thinking about AI like for things like and analyzing, like doing natural language processing, like we mentioned with sort of the big data sets, right? Like scraping of, posts or things like that, and using like natural language processing models to analyze, or for example, using AI to code or to record transcripts or to transcribe interviews and stuff. I think those are also areas we have to be very conscious of as researchers, because anything, instinctively that records and retains data, we know as the sex work community to like have those really heightened kinds of risks. And I think it's kind of like Laura said, like, right, engaging in any of these methods doesn't supplant the need to actually make sure that they're being driven and analyzed and still checked over by people in the community. Like any natural language processing model that's trying to analyze content created by sex workers, we just in the same way as would say like having one or two researchers read those, we need to still be installing rigor and making sure there's sex workers and people with lived experience who are at the helm of like driving use of these methods and able to identify the potential risks and things like this. But yeah, I just wanted to flag questions around AI as being very salient and in looking towards the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Tom, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the report in full. For transparency, and I've put it in my bio as well, but I am from Ofcom, which is the UK regulator for online safety. I'm part of our adult service supervision team, so we work with a number of the largest adult services. And I mean, one of the things that I care about quite deeply is doing more proactive engagement with people. I know that you've said in the report and the guidelines about how it can be used for influencing policy making. Do you draw any distinctions between research and like influencing policy, for instance, like conducting things like roundtables and workshops and that sort of stuff? Because that's something that I'm always conscious that we should be doing more of, but it can also feel a bit extractive. It can also feel a bit tokenistic at times. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that can be done in the best way. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, again, sorry, Elizabeth, if I'm jumping in too quickly, feel free to cut me off. Yeah, I hear you. I think there are differences between the research process and then things like implementing policy, which of course can come at the end of research projects often, where you're thinking about disseminating your research and thinking about how it might influence policy or practice. But yeah, it could be a standalone thing, like you said, that you might be involved in. I think lots of these principles still stand, like the importance of like paying people well for their time and to recognize their expertise. The idea that people might contribute and then, you know, change their mind. The idea of consent being ongoing. I think a lot of these things still hold up. Even participatory methods, like, okay, it's not participatory research methods per se, but asking people, you know, affected communities what they want to get out of a roundtable, if they actually want it, if it's actually useful, if it's worth their time, so that they are involved right from the kind of idea through to its delivery and then what happens afterwards. So I think lots of this translates. It might require some adaptations, and happy to chat over email a little bit more around your kind of personal circumstances. But I think a lot of it, you can kind of pick up the general values and principles and apply them in different contexts.
Thank you.
Raven, go ahead, please.
Hey, can you hear me? Yes, cool. Okay, congratulations. We have gold standards. Amazing. So grateful we have this. Um, I led a project in 2006 with sex workers in Vancouver that yielded something similar. It was like research guidance, and then but we're speaking back to the Tri-Council policy statement, which um, is sort of the standard setting for research with human subjects in Canada. Um, and we also did like tips and strategies for sex workers to um, sort of shape their conversations with researchers, give them examples of questions that they should ask or something like that. So just wondering if you're potentially able to do something like that, and I can share those documents with you again. But it'd be nice to kind of have a little hot sheet or something, because sex workers will get approached. And then I wonder about like not that there could be a seal of approval or something similar to that, but then how, you know, people sometimes co-opt these kinds of principles in name but not in deed. So I guess it would be really difficult to create some seal of approval or something like that. But I really like the idea of encouraging researchers to have read this at the very least and implement. But sadly, you know, the costs of and the design of research projects and where the money sits, they're not set up to work with our populations, and they see sex workers as risk, and ethics, you know, committees often do see sex workers that way. But yeah, every way we can push. We have this now, and we'll wave it in people's faces. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Raven. And so nice to see you, by the way. Um, I was thinking the same thing actually, and like even creating some sort of extract from the end of the document principles as a way of basically presenting to researchers for for them to basically check if their work is actually following these principles, and then give assurance to the sex workers' rights organizations that they are working with that they do indeed take into account all these principles. So we could try to design in a way that it is a kind of uh, well-structured kind of checklist, maybe.
The folks who fund research, who fund sex work research, should implement these kinds of guidances as part of
Yeah.
their criteria potentially. So maybe the research bodies.
Carmilla?
Yes, hi. Um, I have a question regarding academic research. And I had a quick look at the report, and it does mention the limitations of ethics boards. I was wondering though if, I don't know, we should also like acknowledge the limitations of the academic processes, such as the peer review processes, because, like one of the issues with this is that the research is not only um, stopped or um, find issues at the conception process, like within the university, but also when it comes to peer review, there are a lot of blocks. So I was wondering, like, if anyone has got any advice, especially for early career researchers, regarding how to hold your grounds with peer reviewers, especially when, like peer reviewers also do have their biases and so on, and how we can ensure that these ethical research or like these as ethical as possible research that we think we have produced is also disseminated within the academic channels.
Yeah. In terms of advice on pushing back and holding your ground, yeah, I think that's always a challenge, and I think obviously the more senior you get, the more the more power that you have to stand your ground. I certainly don't feel like I'm able to stand my ground too much with reviewers, and often feel compelled to address their reviews. But I do think when it comes to things that are contained in this document, for example, which are evidence-based, by which I mean, they come out of sex worker communities. I think we can use resources like this, and we cite lots of sex worker-led resources in here as well, including the Ravens work that she mentioned before. I think we can use some of that evidence to back up why we've made the decisions we've made in our research and why we've made the decisions we've made in our writing, and use that to push back in reviews. I'm not suggesting that will always mean that reviewers back down, but I think that is one approach, and yeah, that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Thank you.
Does anyone have final questions, comments before we close? If not, then I suggest we close this session, and we want to remind, that research must be accountable to the people that it is about. And sex workers and their organizations are experts, and they must be treated as such. And I want to again thank Elizabeth and Dr. Laura Connolly and Dr. Victoria Holt for their contributions in this report and in today's discussion. And again, a big thanks to Lucas Stevenson for laying the groundwork, and to all ESWA members and to the sex worker-led organizations who gave us feedback and input, which was central to this report. Please share and read the report that is in the link. The link is in the chat, as well as the link to join eSworn as well as a research network. If you're a researcher who is doing research into sex work and working or based in Europe and Central Asia. We also invite you to use the guidelines in your own work and share them widely, please. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks, Elizabeth.